Hi, my name is Zachary Sheldon, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Communication at Texas A&M University. And I'm presenting today on my paper, The Limits of Faith-Based Organizations, Lessons from a Big Idea. This paper had its origins in this question of what keeps a faith-based or religious organization faith-based? How do faith-based organizations tell stories about themselves that let them maintain their faith identity? And what can we learn about that to help organizations that are faith-based remain faith-based if that's what they want to be? And I decided to look at that using the company Big Idea as an exemplar. So Big Idea Incorporated was an animation company founded in 1993 by Phil Vischer and his friend Mike Naraki. And they're best known for the production of VeggieTales, the anthropomorphic vegetable characters that told Bible stories and sang songs and had all sorts of stuff going on with them. That was really, really fun. Looking at the history of Big Idea, they seemed like the perfect sort of case study to look at this kind of question, because when it was founded in 1993, Big Idea was initially very successful. Their first home video, Where is God When I'm Scared, was actually the first commercially available computer animation product anywhere. They beat Toy Story by a couple of years. And then over time, the company failed. They went through bankruptcy and had all sorts of problems and was eventually kind of dissolved. So this trajectory of initial success onto ultimate sort of failure and dissolution, to me, seemed to say that Big Idea was a good case study for understanding how a faith-based organization sets itself up using a faith-based identity, and then maybe what leads to the dissolution of a company over time, despite their faith-based values and religious orientation. So to study this, I employed a method called discourse tracing, which involves accruing news stories from across the company's history and sort of putting them in chronological order and asking questions of those stories, such as, what are the narratives and the narrative tropes that are being used in these stories? What are sort of some of the themes and fantasy ideas that are being played out across these stories over time? Basically, how is the story of Big Idea being told in the media? And what is the story that Big Idea is telling about themselves, both through the media and through their own productions? I employed symbolic convergence theory as a way of sort of looking at and understanding the stories that were being told across these news items. Now, symbolic convergence theory looks at the way that narratives and symbols are sort of chained together in the way that they converge and cohere and then are chained out into the larger public sphere. So how do small groups and individuals even tell stories amongst each other? And then how are those stories connected to one another? And then how do they grow and become larger things? And so some important vocabulary from symbolic convergence theory would be the ideas of fantasy themes, fantasy types, rhetorical visions, and rhetorical communities. So fantasy themes are sort of the early stages of narrative, where there's recurring and even detailed narratives that are recounted at the early and emergent stages of shared meaning. So it's small groups or individuals telling stories to each other. Fantasy types are also recurring narratives. They sort of have more archetypal forms that are generated and already sort of chained into public consciousness. So you can think about the story of David and Goliath as being a fantasy type that a lot of people recognize. If you combine fantasy themes and fantasy types, then you can see how they sort of chain together in what symbolic convergence theory calls rhetorical visions, which are narratives that are used to evoke idealized symbolic communities that can bring people together around shared ideas. So the creation of a rhetorical vision uses fantasy types and fantasy themes to try and motivate people towards some kind of community centered around that narrative. Rhetorical communities are sort of the convergence of all of these things into a group of people or a community that is living out and centered on a particular narrative. So with that in mind, looking at the history of Big Idea and its trajectory from early success to eventual kind of failure, you could see how the company at various times called upon these ideas of fantasy themes, fantasy types, rhetorical visions, and rhetorical communities to create a sense of themselves in the media and to communicate that sense of self beyond the media to their customers and to others out there. So early on in the company's history, when they're first founded and when they first achieve success with their video, Where's God When I'm Scared, you can see that in the way that they talk about themselves in the media, Big Idea is really calling on fantasy themes and types. They're starting out structuring their own narrative. And I would say that they have two sort of consistent fantasy themes and types that they call on. One, I call the humble vanguard. So this is the idea that big idea is in telling stories of biblical value. They're standing up against the larger machines of Hollywood industry, and that they're the vanguard of sort of conservative biblical values in America. At the same time, they also, Big Idea and Phil Vischer in particular, kind of complicate this by talking about themselves in a way that I characterize as a fantasy theme of moral mogul. So Vischer talks about how he wants Big Idea to be half Walt Disney, half Billy Graham, if that can happen without creating toxic fumes, he says in one interview. And so what this shows is that even though they're thinking with this sort of humble vanguard story that positions them as a little David taking on Hollywood Goliath, Vischer is not above thinking of Big Idea along the same lines as Walt Disney. Now, Walt Disney obviously is not a Christian media company, he wasn't a Christian media person, but Vischer is saying, I want to be like Walt Disney, but moral instead of the sort of larger cultural immorality that maybe people associate with the company. So you have these two fantasy themes and types that are a little bit, they're similar, but they're also a little bit conflicting. The humble vanguard, which is Big Idea as David versus Goliath, and then the moral mogul, which is Big Idea as Walt Disney. Over time, the company is successful. They bring out more videos. They even introduce a new franchise, 321 Penguins, and they produce a movie in 2002, Jonah, a VeggieTales movie. At the same time, though, in their conversation with the media and in the way that they present themselves, I would argue that their sort of prior fantasy themes and types combine into a rhetorical community that I would call corporate Christian. Because basically what happens is Big Idea expands rapidly, and they even expand where they're selling their products. So they're not just in Christian bookstores anymore, they're in Walmart, in Target, etc. There's a move to push VeggieTales into schools, but that requires that they water down the biblical message and take out some of the Bible verses. And so they maintain their like good values while eliminating some of the more overtly Christian references in their products. So the decline of their explicitly Christian message basically positions the company as a community of corporate Christians. Their moral values follow their corporate values. Eventually, the company really kind of crashes and burns. They have a lawsuit. They go bankrupt and they're sold. And what you have in this era is they step back. So they were at that sort of apex of symbolic convergence where they're a rhetorical community. But in this era, once they have some failure, they actually kind of step back into the role of casting a rhetorical vision. So Phil Vischer in particular, as he becomes sort of less associated with Big Idea as a company, actually articulates a rhetorical vision of himself and the company as found sheep. So he admits in public, he gives a commencement speech, I believe at Biola University, where he talks about how he and the rest of Big Idea let their corporate success get to their heads and they lost themselves along the way. Now, and this was kind of interesting because Vischer is being celebrated for this. He's admitting the mistakes that he made and that Big Idea itself made. And at the same time, Big Idea as a company has basically completely moved away from its founding biblical values, and its own success has really started to wane. He was at peace with his personal walk with God, but Big Idea was basically beyond saving. There's a few implications in Big Idea's trajectory for other faith-based organizations and how they can see themselves living out their faith or religiously based founding narrative. So the first is that faith-based organizations should adopt a limited growth mindset. When Vischer talked about Big Idea being the next Disney and becoming, he said, the most trusted family media company in the world, he's pointing to this sort of larger capitalistic aim that's not necessarily rooted in scripture. So in 1 Timothy 6:10, it says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. Basically, Big Idea thought so much in the narrative of we want to be a corporate media success that they got away from this notion of just small, sustained growth that's centered on the values that you hold. They wanted to grow so fast that they outstripped the speed at which they could maintain their own corporate identity. The second implication is to maintain a coherent biblical narrative. the stories that we tell about ourselves and the stories that we sort of think with as we found an organization and maintain an organization are really important. And there were sort of two different narratives that were being told at the same time, and one of them eventually had to win out, and it did in the corporate Christian rhetorical community. So the implication here is that picking the right story to think with is really important, and then maintaining a coherent narrative using that story is paramount. And then finally, the third implication that I derive from this discourse tracing is to resist a single prominent leader. So Phil Vischer in his memoir and in other writings subsequently has really identified that him becoming identified with the company meant that his own failings and successes were attributed to the company and basically implicated in the company itself. His own moral convictions and disidentifications merged with the organization. And the two of them together basically had a very mixed and problematic sort of reputation. So adopt a limited growth mindset, maintain a coherent biblical narrative, and resist a single prominent leader are the three major implications that come out of this question of how do faith-based organizations maintain their faith-based orientation? And then what are the limits of the stories that they tell themselves and tell about themselves? I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, I'll put my email on the screen, and feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to hear them and to talk about this project. Thank you.